We have the pleasure to be together with Professor Maarten Vansteenkiste, who is working at the Department of Developmental Personality and Social Psychology at the University of Ghent in Belgium. Maarten, thank you very much for accepting this interview.
Thank you for doing it.
Your research group at the University of Ghent in Belgium has been studying the role of motivation since the beginning of the pandemic. So why is it important to study motivation?
Well, because I think the most important way how that the virus is spreading is through our behavior. And our behavior is guided by different motives. And so in that respect, it is important indeed to look at to what extent people are still motivated to follow the measures, or also what type of motivation they actually have, they display. Because we know based on motivational research and also the data we gathered that some types of motivation do have more desirable effects than others. So depending on the extent to which you're motivated, you're more likely, for instance, to keep following the measures, even if, for instance, a police officer is not watching your behavior or your neighbors are not checking whether you're washing your hands. Well, in some cases, of course, some of the measures simply nobody is checking on them. It's all up to you. It's all your responsibility. So that speaks to the importance of more what we call autonomous or voluntary types of motivation.
Can you tell us more about these different types of motivation?
So if we talk about different types of motivation, on the one hand, we have this more autonomous form, but on the other hand is what we call a more controlled form of motivation, where people feel pressured to stick to the measures. And in a playful way, we talk about mustivation. People feel like they must be sticking to the rules or the measures. And in many cases, people do have the feeling that it's a must. On the moment, it requires more effort from their sides. However, what we know is that, and that's what we in our data also shows, because we have been monitoring people's motivation since the beginning of the lockdown. If we want to predict to what extent, for instance, people will stick to the measures next week or in the next month, well, autonomous motivation is a much more robust predictor than controlled motivation or mustivation. And I think especially on a moment, for instance, you move towards a phase of relaxations, which we had also in Belgium. We have had stricter measures and more relaxed measures. But on a moment of relaxation, well, on that moment, people also need to take more responsibility for their actions, and they can actually be seduced out meetings, social meetings, like a social gathering, a family party, a barbecue. We had a summertime here in Belgium, and people got a lot of invitations. And on that moment, your self-control is actually put to a test, so to speak. But if you're control motivated, it takes much more effort to self-control your energy draining. And so at a certain point, well, people just give up because they can no longer resist the temptation, for instance, to the social meeting. And in that respect, we have been assessing on a week-to-week basis in the beginning, even on a daily basis during 2 full months, to what extent people stayed autonomously or control motivated. We saw actually that the motivational support gradually got down throughout the crisis. In the beginning, more than 80% of Belgian citizens was like fully behind the measures. They saw their value and their importance. And then we have been going to ups and downs. And now in July, we had a moment of more relaxed measures. At that point, there was like still 69% behind the measures, but a second wave came up now in August. And so we moved back to a stricter phase, and people's motivation got actually eroded, got down to a 35%, so 1 out of 30, which attracted, well, a lot of attention in the media, because as I said before, if you want to have a preventive impact on the crisis, you need to influence people's behavior through motivational forces. At the same time, mustivation has been going up at such a point that mustivation and voluntary motivation are equally important.
So these two types of motivation can coexist?
Well, in many cases, people do have a mix of different motives. So it's a mix of, let's say, autonomous and controlled motives, but some also controlled motives together with what we call amotivation. Is like a form of you're completely demotivated. You feel helpless because you feel like, okay, my behavior is not making the difference here anymore. It doesn't help to get towards the desired outcome of reducing or flattening the curve, for instance. So people start to question the effectiveness of their behavior. They are fed up because of the efforts they have been making. So they display a pattern of helplessness, which often goes together with controlled motivation as well. So let's say the profile throughout the crisis has been changing from the majority of people being autonomously motivated towards an increasing number of people showing also a combination of helplessness and controlled motivation. Although we still have people who are feel convinced, but still, this has been going down quite a lot. So that is interesting. The motivational pattern has been changing, and it's also interesting to see how at certain moments the government, had important communications like press communications. We had, as I think has been the case in every country, where they decide we are, let's say, relaxing the measures, introducing stricter ones. This is decided based on the input of experts. And then we have a formal press communication. And in many cases, this communication has been rather demotivating. I mean, not inspiring, not connecting, not binding, a lack of clarity. And this in the findings, we have seen almost every time like a drop in motivation following the communication, even if in some cases perspective was given to the population, like people would be said, okay, maybe in a couple of weeks we will be able to relax X or Y. In spite of the perspective, because of the rather poor communication skills of the government, the motivation simply went down.
Here, it's we have this idea of that we need strict rules, strict regulations, and strong punishments. And people think that this is the way to make people stay at home and to take care. So what can you say from your research about it?
Well, I would doubt whether this is the best strategy in the long term. Because, of course, if you punish people, for instance, for not wearing masks, or we also have had a night clock in Belgium, actually in Antwerp, where people would not be allowed to get out after 11:30. They could heavily be punished for it. But the question is, of course, the issue is, of course, as long as the punishments are operative, people might stick to it, but they fail to fully internalize or to own the measures. They don't accept them as something that is valuable to do in its own right. And that's this autonomous form of motivation precisely implies that people do see the value and the importance, the necessity, and they take personal responsibility for their behavior rather than acting for instance, out of fear of punishment, not out of fear of being infected, but the fear is here, the external punishments. And so an interesting case I think we had here in Belgium is also there was a call for, let's say, a more strict set of measures also with respect to wearing mouth masks. Initially, it was only the obligation to wear them during public transport, so in the train, in the bus, and the reasoning was, okay, on that moment it's hard, if not impossible, to keep physical distance between yourself and the other travelers in the bus, for instance. So it made all sense to ask people on that moment to wear a mask. And then in some cases, we had initially a stricter lockdown, but then we were allowed to visit, for instance, stores with multiple people, not just one person. It also become more crowded. And so they extended, let's say, on that moment, there was a lot of discussion. Will we extend it also, this obligation to wear a mask to stores or even in public space? So, and there was an increasing, let's say, support for that strict measure, for this obligatory measure. And I think that was a critical point where indeed the government was required to take action, because the majority of people were behind the fact that we would mandate people to actually wear a mask, because there was support for it. People saw the logic of it. But the point is, of course, if you are entering a store where a lot of other people are, you're not wearing the mask out of because you have to. Subjectively speaking, it's not because you have to, because it's you choose to do so because you see it is crowded here and it is critical now to wear a mask. So I think this is a point you had, like a flipping point where, okay, there was more and more, let's say, legitimacy built into the population that we needed to transfer to a stricter regime, which was actually accepted by people and didn't subjectively experience, was not subjectively experienced as an obligation, but as, let's say, the normal state of affairs, a normal thing to do, given how the situation was evolving. Yet, I think I can also give you an example here in Belgium where the measures were becoming too strict with respect to wearing mouth masks, because let's say the central government was a little bit too lax, and so they were asked to take more action. Then they introduced those more stricter mandated wear masking in also stores, and then they transferred power to local authorities to develop a more strict set of rules within their communities. And a lot of local authorities took advantage of the situation actually to introduce a very strict set of rules with respect to wearing masks, saying that you need to wear it all the time. Even if, for instance, I would go outside with my wife or the children, go into a park, or somebody would let out his dog for an evening walk, you would need to be wearing a mask. And it doesn't make sense to wear the mask on that moment because you're just with the people from your own, what we call here a social bubble, from your own social family. So there is no risk involved because nobody else is in the streets. So on that moment, people felt like, okay, that doesn't make sense now. It doesn't make, and that on that moment, it does feel like an obligation to wear the mask. Yet fortunately, we have actually been arguing against wearing mask on those moments because people need to judge themselves, learn judging themselves, whether it's needed or not to wear the mask. And now they have turned down again or turned back those stricter measures in a lot of communities. And now it's only mandated to have your mask with you in your pockets, and you need to judge yourself to wear the mask or not. And I think that is important because then it speaks to people. Well, it's a, let's say it's a call from the government to the citizens to take personal responsibility, to be reflective of when to wear it and not. And so it's a way to ask an engagement from the population.
But I think it's very interesting, and because we also have here very strict measures of using the mask all the time. But it's interesting what you say, that you what is necessary is that you have it with you and use it when it's required. But that means that you need also to give information to the population about this. And I think sometimes that's not coming. How do you suggest to give this information to people to have a good judgment, let's say?
Well, it's true. You need to educate the population, much as we educate children, for instance, with respect to, let's say, moral norms or any kind of norm, not lying, not stealing. You need to give information so people can start to think about it. They have a better insight in when it is needed and not. And in Belgium, we have a very simple rule. If you cannot keep distance, and distance means 1.5 meters, that's the minimal distance you need to leave between you and somebody else. If that is not possible, well, just put on your mask, and that's it. So in a way, it's very simple. I think we also need to be clear about what are the effects of wearing the masks within those circumstances, and what is the effect of not wearing it. And biostatisticians could, for instance, predict models of, let's say, the curve of how the infections would evolve, depending on whether people would be adhering to this measure or not adhering to it. And I think that's also a matter of educating our population to make clear, okay, this is the hypothesized evolution in the infections if none of you are going to stick to this measure, and this is the positive impact we may have if you do so.
It's interesting. So showing the two ways, because sometimes here I think people are showing more, the bad things that can happen, but not highlighting enough the good things that could happen of wearing it.
Yeah, I think if it's indeed a matter of, well, if you show, let's say, the hypothesized curve, in the case of a stricter set of measures or a more relaxed one, you provide them with, say, with an if-then situation. It's like hypothetical. Let's say if we would relax the measures, that's the effect. And so people can then start to see the potential importance of sticking to the measures. And then I think we can see also whether, for instance, the curve is evolving as was predicted, let's say 2 weeks ago. So you can map the actual curve to the hypothesized one and communicate feedback to the population, saying, okay, but through your efforts, we are now capable of, let's say, flattening the curve to such an extent that we get close to the predicted curve 2 or 3 weeks ago. And that's because of your efforts. So on that moment, people gain confidence and experience a sense of efficacy in the fact that it's through them that indeed we achieve those desirable outcomes.
I think that's interesting because here we had very strict measures until the 30th of June. Then the measures were like you will need to take care of yourself, and but many people interpret these as the president said, now you are at your own and see what you can do. And so I think people will feel, like you said, like more helplessness and these kind of things. So how to start working with this type of group?
Well, I agree. We had a kind of similar moment here in the crisis where I think it was beginning June, where our prime minister basically said during a press release that, or a communication by the government, that now the situation has changed. He said, you get back your freedom. Everything is possible except, she said, except X, Y, and Z. While before we were, let's say, in a situation of prohibitions, she wanted to turn it around and say everything is possible except blah, blah, blah. But the problem was that, let's say, message of, on the one hand, hope and freedom was interpreted by people as, okay, we can do whatever we want to do. It's like unlimited options, we are back. And so people really, well, they enjoyed the freedom they got, and they went far beyond what was actually, well, requested or what you could expect to be reasonable. But of course, this message of freedom, people are not capable to, let's say, to regulate their own behavior if you don't build a motivational support system around them. And that's what we have been arguing for a lot. That is, you need to build a system of motivational support around it. And this could be done in a number of ways. And I give you two examples. Well, one example is we have been arguing to develop more a traffic light system. So that means that we have, for instance, 4 or 5 colors. We go from green to orange. So green, yellow, orange, and red. So from green to red. And with each of these colors, a particular set of measures is connected to each of these colors. For instance, in the case of yellow, you could still go to restaurants, but you can only go with 6 people. In terms of social contacts, that's possible. In orange, this is possible, blah, blah, blah. So it becomes stricter depending on the color. And so this is clearly defined in advance. That is indeed what will be happening if we enter this phase, this alarm phase, because you can actually compare it with an alarm system we have here for terror attacks. So it's kind of similar. But then, so you describe and define fairly accurately what is requested for each color, and then you're transparent about the criteria you use to actually switch from the one color to the other. Are we going to switch based on the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, the number of dead people, whatever? So what is the cocktail, let's say, of parameters we rely upon, and what are the critical thresholds to do so? And I think that's a matter of indeed then using that color system and saying, okay, if we transgress this threshold, that means, and if this threshold is transgressed, for instance, for 3-4 days, just to give a random example, then it means we will shift from yellow to orange. So things become stricter. So people can clearly start to follow and monitoring the situation themselves. They are actually more through the colors informed about, let's say, the risk that is still present in the society. And we know that based on the findings as well, that risk perceptions, if you perceive the risk of infection to be high, well, people are more voluntarily motivated to take action. So it's a matter of course, this does need to be at a point of inducing anxiety, but I think we need to communicate in a transparent way about, let's say, the risks that are still present in society, so people can then align their behavior with the perceived risks on that moment. And so the color code system actually is a way to promote corona awareness about the potential risks in your area. And so we are at the point where, okay, this is introduced more kind of in education, but we want to move to introduce this in multiple life domains, and it creates a more predictable situation for people. Because at this point, what basically happens is that there are some experts who, and I'm saying it now a little bit in a strong way, who gather in a dark room about what is needed, and then this is communicated by the government. But all by a sudden, so to speak, well, it's not all by a sudden because people are informed on a daily basis, but there is, all by a sudden, we do have stricter measures. And some people feel like, okay, I don't have any perspective also where we are moving to, what is our goal, what is our objective. And so by having those thresholds, you also have objectives built into, and a pathway. For instance, you could say, if we are sticking to those measures for, let's say, 4 weeks now, we will achieve this intermediate step, this intermediate goal, and then we move on to this goal. And if we reach this goal, that means a more relaxed set of measures. So it becomes more predictable and controllable by people. So that's one example of let's say, creating a more stronger system of motivational support.
And that would help also to cope with the uncertainty of this situation.
Yeah, to deal with the uncertainty of the situation, because I think the situation the virus is kind of unpredictable to some extent. It can quickly, the situation can quickly change. But still, by having this color code system, it does become more predictable, and people can monitor and self-regulate better than that system is simply not there.
Perfect.
Another thing we have been proposing, as much as you have an ecological footprint, we would suggest also developing a tool which actually is like a corona footprint. And people can actually, through responding to a set of questions tied to a specific situation, you can get, let's say, an estimate of the risk you're taking. And then dynamically there would be built-in options where people would be said, okay, if you want to reduce your risk, why don't you try X, or why don't you try Y, for instance? So you give options to people who can then choose to actually reduce their impact or take less risk, because through reflection, they come to the decision that it may be better in the given situation to act differently. Those two tools, let's say you have this more tool of corona footprint, which fosters reflection and responsibility taken, is then, well, developed together with, or that's the idea, to develop it together with the color code system, which is actually locally developed, because it doesn't make sense, for instance, in the one region in Flanders to have, the color could be very different in the one region compared to the other. So the measures could also vary by region. And that, I think, from a motivational perspective, also makes sense. There is no need to have the same set of measures across the country if the areas or the risks are very different depending on the area you are. Because if the risks are fairly low, I mean, it makes sense to introduce more relaxed measures, because that's also what we saw. Of course, following the measures by itself takes a lot of energy of people. And so by relaxing them, you provide, let's say, you provide them the necessary energy to recharge their batteries, their mental batteries, to reconnect with people, to build their connections and social connections, to regain some of their autonomy, which is threatened. And so we see that if you during relaxations, people reinvest in their psychological needs, which then provide the necessary motivational support, let's say, or to keep on following the measures if the situation becomes again more critical on a later moment in time.
It is very interesting because you make information available to people and this helps them to choose what to do. Here in Peru, we have a challenge because here we still have people that are illiterate or with low levels of education. How to make information available to them?
I think in the situation of Peru, of course, well, given that a number or a certain percentage is not capable of reading, for instance, well, you need to have infographics which show in a very accessible way through pictures what the impact is of their behavior, how the virus is spreading if you don't follow the measures, for instance. So it would be a matter of indeed coming up with a number of infographics that are very down to earth, very easy to understand.
Yes, and also that takes me to another question. Here we have a situation. You have been here and you know more or less different Peruvian places. In our country, there are informal workers that have the need to go out to be able to work so they can have the money to eat. Or maybe they know that they need to wash their hands because the government is saying so, but they don't have water in their homes. So how to make them, and so they do not wash their hands so often as they would need to do, but it's not because they don't want to, they don't have these conditions. And other people what are saying are like blaming these people that do not do what is needed. So how can we help in this situation to these people? What do you think would be important to do there?
Well, if you don't have water to wash your hands, it's simply not possible to wash them, I would say. So I would think that it's also a good deed, let's say, of the richer people than to supply the sufficient water or to create the conditions such that people can follow the measures. So that this is not a matter of being unmotivated. I think it's here a matter of just missing conditions, missing physical conditions for this to happen. And we have seen here in Belgium, well, during the first wave, a lot of people who were very supportive of the nurses, and because the healthcare system was a little bit under stress because there was the threat that we wouldn't have enough beds in the hospitals. And so there was a lot of support coming from all citizens. For instance, we had hand clap actions on every night at 8 o'clock. People would go outside, the neighbors, and then clapping hands just to thank and to express our gratitude towards doctors, nurses, everybody involved in the crisis. So that was it's maybe a simple example, but still was strong and it was binding in some ways. I would think at this point in Peru, it would be the ideal moment for richer people to stand up and be pro-socially oriented, and then to support what is possible in these cases, so actually people can wash their hands, because there's a lot of simply a lack of water there. It's like a missing physical condition to stick to the measures.
So I think what you say is very interesting, because the government has done some measures to get into people, but sometimes the measures they took, for instance, giving money to people, make people go to the bank and make long lines, and people were very close to each other. So I think maybe it would be interesting to provide these conditions. If they need to use masks, to provide the masks, to make them
Right.
available. If they need water, to the government and other people, I'm not saying only the government, but also to make the water available, so things, then you have more options, like to
It's
do.
true. Well, we for instance, as citizens, we got a couple of masks from our local authorities here. So that was also on the other hand. I mean, a lot of these masks were self-made by people, and also they were made by neighbors, and then people helped one another in producing the masks because they were sewed by people themselves, and so on that moment there was also a lack of masks. So you saw the ways how people started to support one another, and it was done on a voluntarily basis. So it's also for a good cause. You can do it. Of course, we can also rely on the government to supply on critical places the masks and the water and the disinfection gel to use it.
Yes. So yeah, that's interesting. Martin, how does the younger population cope with this? For instance, unfortunately, here we had a terrible situation in the last weekend that people went to a discotheque when it's, of course, not allowed. So did you have, or do you have any situation that the younger people have more difficulties to cope with these, like in their 20s or something like that?
Yes, we have seen this systematically in the data actually from the very beginning. We noticed that younger generations, like early adults in their early adult years, which is indeed between, let's say, 18 and 35, they were the ones who are the least motivated. They saw less value and importance in sticking to the measures. But I think it does make sense also from their perspective. If I would have that age, I would probably act similarly, because I mean, why are you sticking to the measures? It's not for out of self-interest. I mean, of course, it's to some extent it's to prevent you get infected, but we know that younger groups or populations are less likely to suffer from the infection, so it's less severe infections. So there's less of that, let's say, threat of a strong infection. So that reduces, let's say, the self-interest in sticking to the measures. But so why would you do it? It's actually to help preventing other people. And it does have value, for instance, to stick to the measures to protect your family members or your neighbors or your grandmother or whatever. But I think so that seems logical. And we also, the other thing we see in the data is that if you look at the need for relatedness, the psychological need for relatedness and autonomy, those two needs are most strongly threatened for those younger adults as well. And I think if you compare this to the, let's say, people above their 70s, well, they are retired in Belgium, and the lockdown situation where they have fewer contacts, that doesn't deviate so much from, let's say, their daily living pattern compared to for the younger generation. So for the younger generations, there's much more of a rupture of their daily routines compared to the elder generations, to the older generation. So and in that respect, I think it does make sense that they do suffer more. It's legitimate in their case because, well, adolescents and young adults are used to, well, go out to gather with multiple friends, to have social meetings much more maybe than people in their older years.
So what to do with the younger population?
Well, I think they have been trying this, and I think they have, with some success, they have been trying to um, ask role models in those generations to actually promote the message that, well, engaging in the protective behavior is what is required. And so the role model is then displaying the required behavior, which can be copied or imitated by the younger generations. And by, let's say, having a social influencer saying that, somebody who is popular in that age group, well, we may have a stronger impact, because I think at this point, at least in Belgium, there's like an overload of COVID-related information. People are just completely saturated.
Yes, also here.
So that means you can no longer process the information anymore. So there's no, let's say, receptiveness anymore for even critical information, unless it's really an alarming phase, let's say, then maybe they will open up again. But I think that has to do with the fact that we have been communicating a lot of numbers, also in Belgium now. Every day we started again with daily press communications about the numbers. And the question is, okay, this is a lot of technical information, which doesn't always have psychological meaning. People don't know, is this now a strong increase? Let's say 3% increase. So should we bother? Should we get concerned? And so what are we going to do about it? Does my behavior have an impact here? That's, for instance, that question is not really always addressed. It's not shown through figures that we do it's through our behavior and our sustained motivation for engaging in a behavior that we make a difference here. So we have been saying, rather than, let's say, communicating all of these technical numbers, which leads to a saturation and, let's say, an overload of information, let's have some forecasting, like you have a weather forecast, we have some kind of corona forecast. And that would be once a week or maybe twice, where you really, in 10 minutes, you show with clear and accessible infographics on television what the situation is, how it may evolve, what the impact of our behavior is, how we have been doing good. We have, for instance, testimonies, people who talk about how they struggle with following the measures, but still keep being motivated, how role models talk about what they do. And so it would be only, let's say, a 10-15 minute news item, a corona-related forecasting, and looking back, which would be full of, let's say, psychologically relevant information to sustain the motivation of people. And I think the idea would be, by less is sometimes more, so by communicating less technical information, but at some point trying to catch people's really receptiveness. I mean, maybe we'll have a stronger impact than those daily numbers, which people are not interested anymore at the moment.
Yes, indeed. That is also happening here. We have lots of information and always bad information, so people are really tired of it. And Maarten, here we have a problem that the trust in authorities started to decrease. So that doesn't help to take the measures or to follow the measures. So that something like that happened there, like with the people in the government, and that people lost their trust?
Well, I think they have. I don't have numbers to show this or to say, okay, that's indeed what happened. But what the general impression of people is indeed that the government has been communicating a lot, but in fairly confusing ways. The measures were too complicated, or they were initially introduced and then revisited or refined, and so after every communication by the government, there was like a follow-up of let's say 5 days of further communications. And after a while, people they were like fed up with it. So we kind of, I think people lost indeed some trust or confidence in the fact that the government can really master the situation, can really handle the situation in an efficient way. So that probably also has an impact on people's dropping motivation, because they feel like it's up to us. We are a little bit left to our own, left by ourselves, how to handle the situation. Also, I think also we need to invest more in a socially binding project where we have a collective purpose, and we have people all behind the same kind of project. I mean, it needs to be a social project with key, let's say, role models, also favoring this project, talking about it. In a way, we have something like what is called the Warmest Week here in Belgium, which is a pro-social week full of actions of charity actions, like pro-social actions. And then people collect money for certain vulnerable groups. So you can choose your own group you want to support. And we have been suggesting we could actually organize, let's say, the Warmest Corona Week also, where people, and this is actually a radio channel which is organizing the Warmest Week. So we could reorient the theme of this year towards Corona, and people could then come to talk about their experiences today, or maybe even say how they support their neighbors or how they support their grandmother. And so it's like you create a social atmosphere, yes, where people feel more connected to one another than what is the case now.
Yes, that's very, very nice. So to sum up a bit, it is really important to be specific in the information given, and also that this information is very clear, to have clear messages. For instance, here sometimes what happened is that we have information, but it was not clear. So we didn't know what to do or what not to do.
Right. But I think the what is needed from the population and how they can succeed in reaching those, well, in putting this into practice, that needs to be very clear. So that there needs to be basics. This is structure. But the structure needs also to be conveyed in an autonomy supportive way, so that people actually accept and endorse the structure you introduce. And autonomy support would indeed be, okay, you give a clear rationale for why you ask, for instance, people to limit their social contacts. Why is this so important? So you show the value of that. You also empathize with the fact that this is fairly difficult to do, because it goes a little bit against our natural tendency to gather with others. So you empathize with the difficulty people experience there, and you maybe even talk about this from your own perspective in a more authentic way, how somebody, the prime minister, may as well say, okay, I also find this fairly difficult now. We had a number of social meetings in the family ahead. We needed to cancel it. I mean, if you show your more human face, your human features, people may more easily resonate with you and feel a sense of connection with you. And it's through the relatedness with the prime minister that people then start to endorse more readily what is actually required from them. So it's a matter of building, let's say, a sense of rapport also with your citizens.
Yes, which is very important indeed, and we need that indeed. And Maarten, from what can we learn from your research? You have told us, but sometimes they say that is Belgium, that is, and we are so far away, or that doesn't come here, or in other countries like Spain. What do you think? What can we learn from your data that could be useful for every country, or let's say to different people, and why?
Well, I think the work is drawn from self-determination theory, and self-determination theory takes a fairly universal perspective towards, let's say, what are critical motivational processes. And so I would expect that, let's say, the basic findings we observe here, that autonomous or voluntary motivation is predicting persistent adherence to the measures, while motivation and this sense of helplessness and demotivation is not, is something that would be applicable across countries. I wouldn't expect to find a lot of variation in, let's say, the predictive power of these different types of motivation. Yet the way how you feed those different types of motivation, how you facilitate autonomous motivation may be a little bit different. And I mean, that also speaks to your question regarding, let's say, younger generations, the way how you can, let's say, show them the value of sticking the measures may be different from what you will do in the case of older populations. Because in both cases, you may provide rationales, or you may ask, for instance, peers to talk about their own motivational reasons for sticking to the norm. So as a kind of testimony, a motivational testimony, where somebody you or feel more connected to it is telling you why he or she is still continuing to follow the measures. And so on that moment, I mean, what you do is the general principle is giving a good rationale. There's rationale may come from peers, but let's say the specific rationale may be tailored to the group. The situation for Peruvian youngsters may be fairly different from the situation from Belgian youngsters. And even within Peru, and that's maybe even more important, you may have more heterogeneity, more differences between different groups within Peru than in comparison to Belgium, because we often say, okay, Peru is very different from Belgium, but I think the within country differences may be larger than the between country differences.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. That's true. So, in a nutshell, what can we do to feel better? What can we do to follow the rules? And how to cope with this situation?
One first thing is, I think, if we talk about the government and the experts involved, one first thing is, well, don't make the rules stricter than needed. If people don't see the value of the rules, they feel like it's a should. And motivation is not a good form of motivation. It doesn't predict durable engagement in the measures. So there needs to be a good logic behind the measures. For instance, wearing masks in specific places, that makes sense when it's too crowded. So choose your battles. That's one thing. Second point is that try to communicate about the value of people's behavior. So why is it that following the measure does make a difference? Can you show a graph where if people stick to the measure, the curve will flatten more quickly than when they don't? So what if they don't? You see that the decrease is much less steep of infections. So you show the impact, the potential impact or the real impact of people's behavior. And by showing the real impact, you actually provide positive feedback. So people feel like, okay, we are making progress to, for instance, flatten the curve. So that's like a second suggestion. The third one would be try to make it predictable for people. So what is the target you're aiming for? That target is that, let's say, 100 infections a day. Is that the moment where you'll introduce relaxations? So people get some perspective, an objective where they can strive for. You may add a color system here, and through that color system, people can better monitor their behavior. A fourth issue would be try to invest in a mobilizing social project where people experience a sense of connection with others. They feel unified in their efforts to fight the virus, to battle it. And any kind of, let's say, charitable actions of charity, good deeds, may help others, well, to keep on following the measures. A fifth thing, I think, is if there's virologically room for relaxations, well, please use that room, use that space and relax the measures, because we know that on the moment you introduce relaxations, people can recharge their batteries, their psychological needs for autonomy and relatedness will be satisfied more and better. And that provides the necessarily motivational, let's say, engine to continue on more difficult moments later on. So these are a set of, let's say, well, guidelines or suggestions. It's maybe more suggestions, recommendations than guidelines. So how you can possibly handle the situation in Peru.
Yes, indeed. Very interesting. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this interview. Thank you very much again, Maarten.
Lennia, let's be in touch. Thank you.